She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a trained SS officer. She was a librarian, a bookkeeper, a seemingly ordinary woman. But in the hell of Buchenwald concentration camp, she became a legend of cruelty so extreme that even the hardened SS men whispered her name in fear. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald, and her story involves a collection so horrifying it defies belief. This is how Ilse Koch, the woman with the most depraved hobby in history, became a monster. Of all the horrors that crawled from the infernal depths of the Third Reich, some have attained the status of dark folklore. They are stories told in hushed tones, urban legends whispered from the gates of hell, so grotesque they seem to defy reality. And at the apex of this pyramid of nightmares sits a single, deceptively mundane object, a lampshade. It is not made of parchment or silk, but of human skin, stretched taut over a wire frame. Its surface is said to be a pale, translucent canvas, intricately decorated with the faded blue and red inks of a sailor's tattoo, an anchor, a mermaid, a lover's name. When the lamp is switched on, it casts a soft, warm glow, illuminating not just the room, but the very depths of human depravity. This object, more than the gas chambers or the mass graves, has become the ultimate symbol of Nazi evil. It represents the final act of dehumanization, the transformation of a human being with a name, a story, and a soul into a piece of household furniture. This legend, whether rooted in absolute fact or embellished by the traumatized imaginations of survivors, is the key to understanding the woman at its center. Her name is Ilse Koch, but history knows her by another title, spat like a curse, the Bitch of Buchenwald, or, more chillingly, the Buchenwald Witch. She is the high priestess of this macabre legend, the artist whose medium was human flesh. The story goes that she would ride her horse through the Buchenwald concentration camp, a queen surveying her foul kingdom. Her eyes, cold and discerning, would scan the haggard lines of prisoners, not for the healthy and strong, but for the beautifully decorated. She was a connoisseur of skin, a collector of tattoos. This is the emotional hook that snags the soul and refuses to let go. When she found a specimen she desired, a particularly intricate dragon on a man's back, a delicate rose on his chest, she would point with her riding crop. That simple gesture was a death sentence. The prisoner would be taken to the infirmary, executed, and then flayed like an animal. His skin, the canvas of his life story, would be tanned and treated, then delivered to the lady of the manor. The legend insists that her villa, which overlooked the camp's main square, was a museum of this human taxidermy. There were not just lampshades, but also gloves made from small, delicate hands and book covers bound in human hide, their titles, perhaps Goethe or Schiller, forming a sickening contrast with the material of their binding. The sheer domesticity of the horror is what gives it its unique power. The industrial scale of the Holocaust can be difficult for the human mind to grasp. The numbers are too vast, the cruelty too abstract. But a lampshade is something we can all picture. We have one in our own living rooms. The legend of Ilse Koch takes the unimaginable evil of the camps and places it right beside your favorite armchair. It transforms the inconceivable into the tangible. This is why her name, more than that of many male commandants who were quantitatively far greater murderers, has become a byword for a uniquely personal, intimate, and sadistic form of evil. She did not just preside over murder, she curated it, domesticated it, and turned it into a decorative art form. But was it true? Did these objects truly exist? The evidence is murky, contested, shrouded in the fog of war and memory. At her trials, prosecutors presented pieces of what they claimed was tanned human skin, but definitive proof of a lampshade or gloves remained elusive. Yet, in a sense, it does not matter. The legend of the lampshade became a truth more potent than any physical object. It became the perfect metaphor for the abyss that was Buchenwald and for the woman who ruled it. To understand how a seemingly ordinary German woman could become the muse for such a monstrous fairy tale, we must first strip away the myth, travel back in time, and find the girl she was before the world knew her as a witch. Our story begins not in a castle of horrors, but in the cultured, civilized city of Dresden. Before the monster, there was a girl. Before the whip, there were books. To find the source of the Buchenwald witch, one must journey to the elegant city of Dresden, the Florence on the Elbe, a jewel box of Baroque architecture and high culture. It was here, in 1906, that Ilse Margaret Kohler was born. Her childhood home was not a Gothic castle, but a simple working-class household. Her father was a factory foreman, a man of modest means and respectable standing. There were no dark portents at her birth, no shadows lurking in her cradle. By all accounts, she was a cheerful, polite, and unremarkable child, one of millions who filled the schools of Imperial Germany before the world tore itself apart. Her youth unfolded against the backdrop of a nation's collapse and its subsequent, convulsive rebirth. She was a child during the Great War and came of age in the chaotic, decadent, and desperate years of the Weimar Republic. While Germany writhed with hyperinflation, political violence, and national humiliation, Ilse pursued a life of quiet normalcy. She attended a commercial school, learned typing and bookkeeping, and eventually found a respectable, if dull, position as a librarian. This single biographical detail is the story's most unsettling paradox, the first emotional hook that catches us. A librarian, a guardian of stories, a custodian of human knowledge and art, a gatekeeper to the accumulated wisdom of civilization. How does a person who spends her days in the silent, sacred company of books become an icon of barbarism? The answer, perhaps, is that the abyss that would one day define her was not born of trauma or ideological fanaticism, but of a profound and terrifying emptiness. Ilse Koch was not a rabid anti-Semite from her youth, nor was she a political firebrand. She was something far more common, and therefore more chilling. She was bored. She was a working-class girl with a taste for a life she could not afford, a yearning for excitement, status, and power that her librarian's salary could never provide. She was adrift in a society that had lost its moorings, and like so many others, she was searching for a tide that would carry her somewhere new, somewhere important. She found that tide in the rising brown wave of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In 1932, a full year before Hitler came to power, Ilse Koch made a choice. She joined the Nazi Party. For her, this was likely not a profound ideological conversion. It was a social and professional opportunity. It was an escape from the musty silence of the library into a world of torchlight parades, stirring music, charismatic speakers, and the intoxicating promise of national rebirth. It offered a sense of belonging, a purpose, and, most importantly, a path to upward mobility. In the social chaos of the time, the party was a powerful escalator, capable of lifting its most dedicated followers from obscurity to prominence. Ilse, with her appealing looks and burgeoning ambition, got on at the ground floor. Her early years in the party were unremarkable. She worked as a secretary, another face in the growing bureaucracy of the movement. But she was learning. She was observing. She was seeing how power worked, who held it, and what they did with it. She was in proximity to men of influence, men who were shaping the future. The polite librarian was fading, replaced by a keen-eyed opportunist, a woman who understood that in the new Germany being forged, her ambition and her gender could be powerful weapons. The moral vacuum within her was being filled not with ideology, but with a cold, clear desire for personal power. She was still just a girl from Dresden, but she was standing at the edge of the abyss, peering in and discovering that she liked the view. All she needed was someone to give her a push, or better yet, a hand to pull her up. That hand would belong to a rising star in the SS, a man as brutal and ambitious as she was. His name was Karl Otto Koch. In the rigid hierarchical universe of the SS, Karl Otto Koch was a rising dark star. He was not a sophisticated ideologue like Mengele or a colorless bureaucrat like Eichmann. He was something more primal, a thug, a former bank clerk who had found his true calling in the institutionalized brutality of the new regime. Koch was a veteran of the first concentration camps. He was a man whose entire career was built on a foundation of violence, corruption, and an unshakable loyalty to Heinrich Himmler. He was coarse, cruel, and possessed an insatiable appetite for power and money. In 1934, Ilse Koch, the ambitious secretary, met this man. It was not a collision of opposites. It was the fateful meeting of two perfectly matched predators. Their courtship was a microcosm of the Nazi ethos itself, swift, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of sentimentality. Ilse saw in Koch everything she craved. He was not just a man. He was a uniform, an office, a symbol of the absolute power that the SS wielded over the new Germany. He was her ticket out of the secretarial pool and into the elite inner circle. In him, her vague ambition found a clear and brutal focus. She recognized a kindred spirit, another soul hollowed out by greed and a lust for dominion. Karl, in turn, saw in Ilse more than just a pretty face. He saw a woman who was not repulsed by his work, but was drawn to it. He saw a partner who would not flinch from the reality of the camps, but would revel in the status and luxury they could provide. This unholy alliance was formalized in 1936. In a secular ceremony, Ilse Koch became Ilse Koch. This was not a marriage. It was a merger, a strategic partnership. This is the crucial emotional hook, the moment she signs her pact with the devil. By marrying Koch, she was marrying the system he represented. She was willingly binding her fate to the concentration camps, to the machinery of terror, to a life funded by theft and built on human suffering. The librarian's quiet world was now a distant memory, burned away in the torchlight of an SS wedding. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer just a party member. She was now Frau Commandant, the commandant's wife, a title that came with its own dark halo of authority. The transformation was immediate and profound. The status she had craved was now hers. She moved into a world of privilege unimaginable to the girl from the Dresden tenement. She had servants, fine clothes, and access to the upper echelons of the SS. But this new status did not soften her. It hardened her. It did not quench her ambition. It inflamed it. The emptiness within her, once filled with longing, was now filling with a sense of entitlement and a burgeoning cruelty. She began to see the world through her husband's eyes, as a place divided not between good and evil, but between the powerful and the weak, the predators and the prey. She had chosen her side. Their union was the catalyst. Karl Otto Koch provided the power and the platform, and Ilse provided the dark imagination. They were a perfect, symbiotic monster. He was the brutal fist, and she was the whispering, sadistic intellect. He understood violence. She would elevate it to a form of perverse art. Shortly after their wedding, Koch received his first major command. He was appointed the commandant of a new, purpose-built concentration camp just north of Berlin. Its name was Sachsenhausen. This would be their first kingdom. It was here, in the pine forests outside the capital of the Reich, that the librarian from Dresden would take her first steps toward becoming the Witch of Buchenwald. In 1936, just north of Berlin, the SS constructed what was intended to be a new paradigm of terror, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. It was not a chaotic jumble of wooden barracks, but a meticulously designed, architecturally modern facility. Its layout was a perfect triangle, with the barracks fanning out from a central guard tower, creating a panopticon where every prisoner was theoretically visible at all times. It was a sterile geometric blueprint for total control, a showcase for the cold efficiency of the SS. Into this laboratory of oppression stepped Karl and Ilse Koch, its newly crowned king and queen. For them, Sachsenhausen was not a prison, it was a fiefdom. This was their first taste of absolute power, and they found it intoxicating. They did not live within the camp's triangular confines, but in a comfortable villa just outside the walls, a bubble of bourgeois comfort separated from the abyss by a manicured lawn. From her window, Ilse could look out upon her husband's domain. It was here, in this first kingdom, that the polite librarian from Dresden truly died and the Frau Commandant was born. The transformation was terrifyingly swift. The proximity to boundless suffering did not horrify her, it empowered her. The fear in the eyes of the prisoners was not a source of pity, but a narcotic. This is the emotional hook where her passive ambition curdles into active sadism. She began to test the limits of her new power. It started small. She demanded absolute groveling deference from the prisoners assigned to work in her home. A glance not cast down quickly enough, a perceived slight in a prisoner's posture, would result in savage beatings, ordered by her and carried out by the guards who were her eager servants. She discovered a profound, visceral pleasure in wielding the power of life and death, even at a remove. She was no longer merely the wife of the commandant. She was an independent and unpredictable source of terror within the camp system. While Karl Otto focused on the large-scale mechanics of brutality and corruption, Ilse began to cultivate her own unique brand of personalized cruelty. Rumors began to swirl among the prisoners and even the SS guards themselves. They spoke of her voracious sexual appetite, her alleged affairs with other officers, conducted almost in plain sight of her brutish husband. More darkly, they spoke of the way she seemed to taunt the male prisoners, her power over them amplified by a current of perverse, humiliating sexuality. She was not just their oppressor, she was their temptress and their tormentor, a goddess of depravity who held their fates in her hands. This fusion of sex and violence would become a defining characteristic of her legend. Sachsenhausen was also where the Kochs perfected their other great passion, graft. They treated the camp as their personal piggy bank. Prisoner possessions were confiscated for their own use. Camp funds were embezzled. They used prisoner labor to build not just their villa, but other amenities, bleeding the system for every mark it was worth. Their greed was as boundless as their cruelty. Sachsenhausen was the rehearsal. It was the dark stage where Ilse Koch discovered her character, honed her methods, and developed her taste for the macabre. She learned that as the commandant's wife, she was above the law, untouchable. She learned that she could inflict pain without consequence. She learned that fear was a tool she could wield with exquisite skill. By the time they left in 1937, she was no longer an apprentice. Karl Otto Koch had been given a new, larger, and even more important command. They were being transferred to a new camp, built on a wooded hill near the culturally significant city of Weimar, the city of Goethe and Schiller. Its name was Buchenwald. The queen was about to ascend to a larger throne, and her reign of terror was just beginning. If Sachsenhausen was their rehearsal, Buchenwald was their grand premiere. In the summer of 1937, Karl Otto and Ilse Koch arrived on the Ettersberg, a wooded hill overlooking the city of Weimar. The location was a stroke of diabolical genius, a dagger pointed at the very heart of German humanism. Below them lay the city of Goethe and Schiller, the cradle of German Enlightenment. Upon this hill, the Kochs would preside over the construction of its absolute negation, a new city of death, a concentration camp that would become synonymous with a uniquely personal and depraved form of cruelty. Their throne was a magnificent villa, a fortress of stolen luxury erected by prisoner labor just outside the camp's main gate. It was a monument to avarice, paid for with funds embezzled from the SS and valuables plundered from the prisoners who arrived daily. While the men inside the wire starved on watery soup, the Kochs hosted lavish parties, their evenings filled with fine wine, music, and the laughter of high-ranking SS officers. The villa was their castle, and from its windows, Ilse Koch had the perfect view of her kingdom. Her drawing room window looked directly out onto the Appelplatz, the roll call square where the prisoners were beaten, tortured, and counted each morning and evening. The daily symphony of suffering was the backdrop to her domestic life. This is the emotional hook where their evil transcends mere cruelty and becomes a form of obscene performance art. The constant panoramic view of hell was not a source of torment for Ilse. It was her private theater. She could watch the drama unfold from the comfort of her armchair, a detached and malevolent God observing the suffering of mortals she had helped condemn. But a view was not enough. Her ambition, now fully awakened, required a stage more grand, a more ostentatious display of her power. She demanded an indoor riding arena, a Reithalle. This riding hall became the ultimate symbol of the Koch's reign. It was built at an astronomical cost of over 250,000 Reichsmarks, a sum siphoned directly from the camp's coffers and the stolen property of prisoners. While thousands of men froze and starved in the flimsy barracks just yards away, an army of enslaved laborers was forced to erect this palace of personal indulgence for the commandant's wife. The image is one of perfect, damnable contrast. Ilse, dressed in elegant riding attire, practicing her dressage skills on a perfectly groomed horse in her heated, state-of-the-art arena, while outside, the smokestacks of the crematorium pumped the ashes of her husband's victims into the sky. Here, in Buchenwald, the last vestiges of the librarian vanished forever. She was no longer just the commandant's wife, a reflection of his power. She had become a sovereign entity, a source of terror independent of her husband. She had a staff of personal servants drawn from the prisoner population, a stable of horses, and the absolute freedom to roam the camp as she pleased. She was the mistress of the manor, the queen of the damned. But observing her kingdom from the castle walls was no longer satisfying. She craved a more direct interaction with her subjects. She would soon descend from her hill, riding her horse not in the safety of her arena, but through the teeming, terrified streets of her hellish kingdom, a whip in her hand, searching for victims. The witch of Buchenwald was about to begin her hunt. The mistress of Buchenwald did not remain in her castle. The view of hell was not enough. She needed to feel its heat, to breathe its air, to walk among her subjects. Her daily descents from the villa into the camp became a horrifying and predictable ritual, a perverse royal procession. Survivors recall the chilling routine. Ilse Koch, dressed in a sharp riding habit or a provocative, form-fitting uniform, would mount her horse. As she trotted through the main gate, a wave of terror would ripple through the camp. Work would stop. Prisoners would freeze in place, heads bowed, eyes fixed on the gravel, praying to become invisible. To be noticed by Ilse Koch was to be cursed. She rode with the languid entitlement of an aristocrat surveying her estate. But this was no gentle country ride. In her gloved hand, she carried a whip. This whip was not merely a riding crop. It was an extension of her will, an instrument of casual, arbitrary violence. She was a goddess of whim, and the slightest perceived infraction, a prisoner not standing at attention quickly enough, a glance that lingered a second too long, could unleash her fury. The crack of her whip was a common sound in Buchenwald, a sharp, sudden punctuation mark in the camp's long sentence of suffering. She did not need a reason to strike a man. His mere existence in her path was reason enough. This is the emotional hook where her evil becomes chillingly banal. This was her hobby. This was her sport. While her husband oversaw the camp's administration and the broader machinery of murder, Ilse's cruelty was deeply personal, almost artisanal. It was the sadism of a bored and empowered woman seeking stimulation. The terror she inspired was a source of profound, exhilarating pleasure. She was not serving the state or furthering an ideology. She was serving her own darkest appetites. Her rides through the camp were hunting expeditions, and the prisoners were her game. But she was not just hunting for the defiant. Her gaze was that of a collector, a connoisseur. As she rode slowly past the lines of emaciated men, her eyes would scan their exposed torsos. She was looking for art. She was looking for tattoos. This pathological fascination became her signature. In a world designed to strip men of their identity, to reduce them to a number, a tattoo was a last, stubborn remnant of individuality. It was a story etched in skin, a mark of a life lived before the camp, a memory of a lover, a symbol of a creed, a souvenir from a distant port. To Ilse Koch, this was not a trace of humanity to be respected, but a unique treasure to be possessed. When she spotted a design that caught her eye, she would point. No words were necessary. The gesture, as subtle as a connoisseur pointing out a painting at an auction, was enough. The man was marked. SS guards would note his number. Later, he would be summoned to the infirmary, often under the pretense of some medical examination. The other prisoners knew what this meant. To be chosen by the bitch of Buchenwald for the art on your skin was a death sentence. The whip was for sport, a tool of temporary pain. But her collector's eye was for keeps. The daily, banal sadism of her rides was merely the selection process for a far more permanent and gruesome collection. The legend, once spoken, takes on a life of its own, eclipsing the person at its center. In the case of Ilse Koch, the tale of the tattooed skin became her very essence. It is the single, defining image of her reign, the detail that separates her from the ranks of the merely brutal and elevates her into the pantheon of the uniquely monstrous. But history is not a fairy tale, and the truth is often a far more slippery and complicated creature than myth. Was the Buchenwald witch truly a human taxidermist? Did she read by the light of a lamp made from a murdered man's skin? To answer this, we must step out of the realm of folklore and into the cold, unforgiving light of the courtroom. After the war, when the full scale of the Buchenwald horror was revealed, the story of the Lampshades became a centerpiece of the Allied case against her. At the Dachau trials in 1947, where she stood accused alongside other Buchenwald personnel, prosecutors presented what they claimed were the artifacts of her ghoulish hobby. The key exhibit was a shrunken head and, more chillingly, 3 pieces of tanned, tattooed human skin. The image was electric. It sent a shockwave through the international press. Here was tangible proof, a piece of the crime you could see and almost touch. The legend was no longer a rumor. It was Exhibit A. Based on overwhelming testimony about her general cruelty and this powerful physical evidence, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But then, the story takes a bizarre and controversial turn. This is the emotional hook that tangles the neat threads of justice into a frustrating knot. In 1948, General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor of the German zone, reviewed her case. Clay, a sober and respected administrator, came to a shocking conclusion. He found the evidence for the most lurid accusations, specifically the lampshades and gloves, to be flimsy and largely based on hearsay. The shrunken heads were determined to be artifacts from South America, likely owned by one of the prisoners. The origin of the tattooed skin fragments could not be definitively traced to an execution ordered by Ilse Koch. He commuted her sentence from life to a mere 4 years, declaring that beyond her complicity as the commandant's wife, the specific charges of her being a homicidal sadist were not sufficiently proven. The world reacted with outrage. The The bitch of Buchenwald was, it seemed, getting away with it. So, what is the truth? The forensic reality is that no complete, authenticated lampshade or pair of gloves made by Ilse Koch has ever been found. The objects presented at the trial were powerful symbols, but their direct link to her personal orders was never established beyond a reasonable doubt for General Clay. It is known that the Buchenwald pathology department, like those in other camps, did prepare anatomical specimens for medical study and for a museum of sorts. This included preserving pieces of tattooed skin. It is entirely possible, even probable, that Ilse saw, owned, or was given some of these items. From this kernel of truth, the full, monstrous legend could have easily grown, fed by the terror and whispered rumors of the camp. But to get lost in a forensic debate over lampshades is to miss the larger, more terrifying point. Whether she literally furnished her home with human remains is almost secondary. The undeniable fact is that she created a climate of terror so absolute, so personal, and so sadistic that thousands of prisoners and guards believed she was capable of it. Her documented actions, the daily beatings with the whip, the public humiliations, the cold-blooded selection of tattooed men for death, were the soil in which the legend grew. She cultivated her own monstrous myth with every crack of her whip. The lampshade may be a ghost, but the witch who haunted Buchenwald was terrifyingly real. And it was her hands, whether they ever touched tanned human skin or not, that wove the legend that would define her for eternity. Her real crimes, however, were not just those of sadism, but of greed. A greed so profound it would eventually turn the SS itself against her. In the meticulously hierarchical universe of the SS, there was one sin considered greater than any cruelty, any brutality, any act of violence against prisoners. That sin was theft from the state. The SS was a criminal organization, but it was a criminal organization with a code. Personal enrichment at the expense of the Reich was not just corruption, it was treason. And by 1941, the extravagant lifestyle of Karl Otto and Ilse Koch had attracted the cold, calculating gaze of Heinrich Himmler himself. The very man who had created the concentration camp system was about to become their executioner. The Kochs, intoxicated by their power and insulated by their success, had grown careless. Their greed had evolved from mere avarice into a form of criminal artistry. They were not just embezzling, they were looting on an industrial scale. Camp funds were diverted into their personal accounts. Prisoner possessions were shipped directly to their villa. They had established an entire shadow economy, using camp labor to build private amenities and selling confiscated goods for personal profit. The 250,000 Reichsmark riding hall was just the tip of the iceberg. Karl had commissioned a private zoo, complete with exotic animals, all paid for with money that should have gone to the war effort. Their corruption was so brazen, so ostentatious, that even their fellow SS officers were appalled. But the final straw was not their theft, it was their hubris. In a moment of staggering arrogance, Karl Otto Koch made the fatal mistake of threatening his superior officers when they questioned his financial practices. He had convinced himself that his position was unassailable, that his friendship with key SS leaders would protect him from any consequences. He was wrong. This is the emotional hook where the tyrant, drunk on his own power, overplays his hand and triggers his own destruction. In 1941, Himmler ordered an investigation. The probe was led by Konrad Morgan, an SS judge who was both incorruptible and relentless. Morgan was the nightmare of corrupt SS officers everywhere, a true believer who was more loyal to the ideology than to any individual. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic efficiency and cold-blooded pragmatism. Morgan's team uncovered a web of corruption that was staggering in its scope. They found evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and the systematic murder of prisoners not for ideological reasons, but to cover up financial crimes. The Kochs had been killing witnesses, eliminating anyone who could testify to their illegal activities. This was not the clean, bureaucratic murder that the SS sanctioned. This was chaotic, self-serving violence that threatened the very order that Himmler had worked so hard to create. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was inevitable. Karl Otto Koch was arrested, tried by an SS court, and sentenced to death. The irony was exquisite. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths in the camps was now facing the same fate, condemned by his own organization for crimes that, in their twisted logic, were considered more serious than genocide. But what of Ilse? The witch of Buchenwald, the woman whose name had become synonymous with the camp's horrors, was conspicuously absent from the dock. She had used her feminine wiles and her cunning to distance herself from her husband's financial crimes. She portrayed herself as a naive wife, a victim of her husband's machinations, a woman who knew nothing of his corrupt activities. The SS investigators, despite their thoroughness, found no direct evidence linking her to the embezzlement. She was questioned, released, and quietly transferred away from Buchenwald. She had slipped through the net once again, her survival instincts as sharp as her cruelty. In April of 1945, as Berlin burned and the Reich collapsed around them, Karl Otto Koch was executed by firing squad. The commandant of Buchenwald was shot not by the Allies, not by the vengeful prisoners he had tormented, but by his own SS comrades. His death was a secret, buried in the chaos of defeat. Ilse, meanwhile, had vanished into the confusion of a collapsing Germany. The witch had outlived her king, and she was about to face a new set of judges who would not be so easily fooled by her protestations of innocence. The trial of Karl Otto Koch was not a public spectacle of justice. It was a clandestine, internal affair, a secret ritual of purification conducted by the Black Order of the SS. In a courtroom draped in swastikas, the devils sat in judgment of one of their own. The prosecutor was the incorruptible Judge Konrad Morgan, a man who saw himself as the righteous sword of the SS, tasked with cutting out the cancer of corruption that threatened to poison the Nazi state from within. The defendant, Karl Otto Koch, was a fallen tyrant, stripped of his uniform and his power, forced to face the cold, merciless logic of the very system he had so eagerly served. It was a perfect, self-devouring snake of a trial. The charges read against Koch were a masterpiece of selective morality. He was not accused of the murder of thousands of Jews, communists, or other enemies of the state. That was his job. He was accused of the murder of a few specific prisoners, men he had killed not for the glory of the Reich, but to cover his own financial tracks. He was not accused of sadistic cruelty. He was accused of unbecoming conduct for an SS officer. And most damningly, he was accused of large-scale embezzlement. In the twisted moral calculus of the SS, stealing from the state was a far greater crime than the industrial slaughter of human beings. And what of Ilse, the witch of Buchenwald, the woman whose name was a curse on the lips of every prisoner, was also under investigation. But on the stand, she was not the whip-wielding sadist of the camp. She was a master of performance. This is the emotional hook that reveals the true source of her power, her reptilian ability to transform, to become whatever the situation required for her survival. Before the SS judges, she was the picture of a devoted, if tragically naive, German housewife. She was tearful, deferential, and utterly convincing in her ignorance. She claimed to know nothing of her husband's financial dealings. The lavish parties? She was simply being a good hostess. The expensive riding hall? A gift from a loving husband whose finances she never questioned. Her affairs and cruelty? Vicious rumors spread by her husband's enemies. She played the part of the wronged woman to perfection, using her femininity as both a shield and a weapon. The stern, all-male court was susceptible. Faced with this performance of bewildered innocence, they found it difficult to imagine her as a financial mastermind. While her husband raged and blustered, Ilse presented a mask of fragile respectability. The verdict was swift and inevitable. Karl Otto Koch, the commandant, was found guilty on all major charges. The SS court, in its infinite and terrifying logic, sentenced him to death. He was to be executed by a firing squad for betraying the honor of the black uniform. Ilse Koch, however, was acquitted. For lack of evidence, the court declared her innocent of the serious charges. She had done it again. She had danced on the razor's edge and emerged without a scratch. While her husband was led away to await his execution, she walked free. The justice of the SS, so absolute in its condemnation of her husband, had been utterly blinded by her performance. In the final chaotic days of the war, in April of 1945, Karl Otto Koch was taken back to Buchenwald, the kingdom he had built. On the grounds of the very camp he had commanded, he was stood against a wall and shot by an SS firing squad. It was a fittingly grotesque end, a footnote of internecine warfare buried in the rubble of a collapsing empire. Ilse, his widow, was now on her own. She was a free woman in a nation that was about to be overrun by armies who carried a very different definition of justice. Her reprieve was only temporary. After the Götterdämmerung of the Reich, the victors began the immense, soul-wrenching task of accounting. While the world's attention was fixed on the main stage at Nuremberg, where the architects of the Nazi state faced their accusers, a series of smaller but no less vital dramas played out across occupied Germany. In 1947, it was Ilse Koch's turn. Tracked down and arrested by American forces in 1945, she had been languishing in custody, a ghost awaiting her final judgment. Now, she was brought to stand trial, not for corruption, but for crimes against humanity. She swapped the obscurity of a fugitive for the Klieg lights of a show trial, and in doing so, she became a global superstar of evil. The trial took place at Dachau, another former concentration camp, a setting saturated with irony. Ilse Koch was the principal defendant in the Buchenwald trial, charged alongside 30 other male members of the camp's staff. From the moment she entered the courtroom, it was clear she was the main event. She was the only woman. Among the collection of brutish guards and nondescript administrators, she was an object of intense and horrified fascination. The international press corps descended like vultures, eager to capture the image of a female monster. She was the perfect villainess for the post-war morality play, a harpy among a flock of brutal but unremarkable crows. This is the emotional hook where she is transformed from a person into a symbol. She became the female face of Nazi depravity, her story a lurid cocktail of sex, sadism, and power that the tabloids could not resist. Was it misogyny, a morbid fascination with a woman who had so grotesquely transgressed all traditional notions of femininity? Or was it that her personal, hands-on cruelty was somehow more comprehensible, more viscerally horrifying than the bureaucratic evil of the men who signed memos? Whatever the reason, the world media latched onto her. The Witch of Buchenwald, the Bitch of Buchenwald, the headlines wrote themselves. The prosecution built its case brick by bloody brick. Survivors, gaunt and haunted, took the stand to testify. They spoke of her riding through the camp on her white horse. They spoke of the crack of her whip. They described her cold, appraising stare as she scanned their bodies for tattoos. And then came the prosecution's trump card, the physical evidence. They presented the court with the shrunken heads and, most damningly, the pieces of tanned human skin. In the sterile environment of the courtroom, these artifacts radiated a cold, dark energy. They made the whispered legends real. They were the ultimate proof of a regime that had not just murdered its victims, but consumed them. On the stand, Ilse was defiant and theatrical. She attempted the same performance that had saved her from the SS, the wronged woman, the innocent housewife who knew nothing of the horrors perpetrated by her husband. She wept, she fainted, she denied everything. But the American military judges were not the SS court. They were unimpressed by her theatrics. Faced with a mountain of eyewitness testimony and the chilling physical evidence, her performance of victimhood collapsed. In August of 1947, the verdict came down. Ilse Koch was found guilty of participating in a common criminal plan to encourage, aid, abet, and participate in the atrocities at Buchenwald. The judges, condemning her sadistic and wanton cruelty, sentenced her to life in prison with hard labor. Justice, it seemed, had finally caught the witch. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the story of her judgment was far from over. In a quiet office, a powerful American general was about to review her case, and with the stroke of a pen, he would unleash a firestorm of controversy that would give Ilse Koch one last, improbable chance at freedom. The life sentence handed down by the American court should have been the final word. The stone slab rolled over the tomb of Ilse Koch's story. But in a stunning, almost surreal epilogue to the trial, the story twisted once more. In 1948, General Lucius D. Clay, the iron-willed American governor of post-war Germany, commuted her sentence. He reduced it from life to a mere 4 years. His reasoning was that of a dispassionate legalist. The most sensational charges, the lampshades and human skin artifacts, had not been definitively proven to be her handiwork. In his view, she was guilty of being a willing participant, but not the ghoulish artist of legend. The world watched in stunned disbelief as the cage door, so firmly shut, was unlocked from the inside by one of their own. The commutation was a legal earthquake, and the aftershocks were a tsunami of global outrage. For survivors of the camps, for the prosecutors who had built the case, for a public that had found in Ilse Koch a perfect symbol of Nazi evil, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The witch of Buchenwald, it seemed, had charmed the general. Public protests erupted. Newspapers screamed with headlines decrying the decision. The United States Senate launched its own investigation. The emotional hook here is the nauseating feeling of justice slipping away, of a monster being unchained by a technicality. But this time, Ilse's luck had a limit. As her release date in 1949 approached, the new West German government, sensitive to public fury and eager to prove its own commitment to denazification, was waiting. The moment the American authorities released her, she was swallowed by the revolving door of justice. She took a few steps as a free woman before being immediately rearrested by German police. This time, she would be tried by her own people, in her own language, under German law. The charges were different: murder and incitement to murder of German nationals within the camp, crimes over which they had clear jurisdiction. In 1951, the German court found her guilty. The verdict was, once again, life in prison. But this time, there would be no sympathetic general, no commutation. The door to the cage clanged shut, and this time, it was locked for good. Her new home was Eichach, a grim, century-old women's prison in Bavaria. The queen was now a number. Her world, which had once stretched as far as her sadistic whims could reach, now shrank to the 44 walls of her cell and the enclosed prison yard. The fine clothes were replaced by a drab uniform. The thoroughbred horses were gone. The whip was gone. The power was gone. Here, she was not the bitch of Buchenwald. She was simply inmate number 232. All that remained was the suffocating weight of time, and in this bleak, monotonous existence, one last, bizarre chapter of her life unfolded. Shortly after her final imprisonment, Ilse Koch, now in her 40s, gave birth to a son. The child, named Uwe, was conceived in prison, the father's identity a secret she would take to her grave, though it was likely another prisoner or a guard. In this sterile silence of captivity, a final, twisted act of creation occurred. The woman who had been utterly indifferent to the suffering of thousands of children, who had built her villa on their ashes, now became a mother. She was not allowed to keep the baby. He was immediately taken and raised in foster care. But this phantom child became the focus of her caged life. She wrote him letters. She knitted for him. She clung to the idea of him as the only flicker of purpose left in her extinguished world. The monster had been stripped of her power and reduced to the most common of human roles, but under the most uncommon of circumstances. The witch was now just a prisoner and a mother, trapped in her cage, waiting for an end that only she could provide. The gears of time grind slow but exceedingly fine, and for Ilse Koch, they ground her legend into dust, leaving only a withered, forgotten woman in their wake. The world moved on. Germany was rebuilt. The Cold War drew new lines on the map. The bitch of Buchenwald, once a global icon of evil, faded into a historical footnote, a ghost haunting her own life in the monotonous silence of Eichach prison. For nearly 2 decades, her existence was a flat, gray line of routine. The morning bell, the tasteless food, the meaningless work, the lock on the door, the power, the adrenaline, the terror she had once commanded, all were gone, replaced by an endless, suffocating emptiness. On the 1st of September, 1967, on the anniversary of the day Germany invaded Poland and plunged the world into the war that had made her, Ilse Koch decided to write her own ending. She was 60 years old. In the quiet of her cell, she took her bedsheets and tore them into strips. With methodical care, the woman whose name was tied to so many violent deaths began to braid her own final instrument. She fashioned a noose, a last, crude loop of fabric. It was a pathetic echo of the whips she had once wielded, a final, self-inflicted act of control in a life that had lost all meaning. Before she climbed onto her small stool, she performed one last act. She wrote a letter. It was addressed to her son, Uwe, the phantom child she had never been allowed to raise, but who had become the sole object of her affections. This letter is her final testament, the last and most baffling emotional hook of her story. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. There were no expressions of guilt for the suffering she had caused, no remorse for the lives she had destroyed. Instead, it was a long, rambling screed of self-pity. She portrayed herself as a victim, a scapegoat, a woman unjustly condemned by a world that needed a monster and had chosen her. She insisted she had to die because there was no other justice for her. It was the final, unrepentant performance of a woman who, even at the precipice of death, could not or would not see the monster in her own reflection. Was it the pathetic cry of a woman so steeped in narcissism that she had genuinely convinced herself of her own innocence? Or was it the last, calculated act of a master manipulator attempting to poison her son's mind with a final lie to preserve for him a memory of a mother who was wronged rather than wrong? The question hangs in the air, as unanswerable as the nature of evil itself. After finishing the letter, she secured the noose, stepped off the stool, and surrendered to the last loop. The next morning, the guards found her. The witch of Buchenwald was dead. Her passing made minor headlines, a brief flicker of a long extinguished fire. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a quiet corner of the Eichach cemetery, a final, anonymous end for a woman whose life had been a spectacle of infamy. Her story ends not with a bang, but with the quiet snap of a life extinguishing itself in a lonely prison cell. There was no divine retribution, No final courtroom reckoning where the truth was laid bare. There was only the sad, pathetic exit of a woman who had become a prisoner of her own myth. The legend of the lampshades and the tattooed skin will live forever, a story more potent and enduring than the woman who inspired it. But the real Ilse Koch, the bored librarian from Dresden who sold her soul for a taste of power, simply ceased to be, her life a dark tapestry that concluded with a single self-tied knot.